Hello, I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey ahead. Russia's regions are running out of money, and Moscow's solution is more demands. The Kremlin takes the tax revenue, issues the orders, funds its own priorities, and leaves governors to explain to angry citizens why hospitals are closing and budgets are bleeding. They are running the country as a customer service scam. The center handles the branding. The regions handle the complaints. Now, some governors are doing something quite radical. They are asking each other for help. When provinces start bailing out their neighbors, it is a sign the system above them is failing. So, let's discuss how Moscow's cash grab is pushing Russia's regions towards financial collapse and why the people holding the bag may not stay loyal forever. Here is a look at that latest report.
Reports from early February 2026 have surfaced indicating that Russia's Orenburg region received 400 million rubles in subsidies, approximately $5.2 million, from the Nizhny Novgorod region to finance one-time bonuses for new contract soldiers. Analysts say this reveals more than a technical budgetary maneuver. Instead, these inter-region payments point to the quiet evolution of how Russia's regions are coping with the mounting financial burden of the war in Ukraine. The mechanism in question is a so-called horizontal subsidy, a tool formally introduced into the Russian budget code in 2019. In theory, it allows one region to transfer funds to another for mutually agreed purposes, such as infrastructure or education. In practice, it has rarely been used to subsidize other regions and typically only by wealthier ones, such as the Moscow region, to finance poorer regions. Russia's Orenburg turning to another region to finance enlistment bonuses suggests something unusual. The budget strain is no longer abstract. The subsidy from the Nizhny Novgorod to the Orenburg region covered payments of 400,000 rubles, roughly $5,200, for nearly 1,000 new contracts at the end of 2025. Last year alone, the Orenburg region spent nearly 12 billion rubles, approximately $156 million, on such bonuses. This amount is comparable to its yearly expenditures on municipal preschool and school education. Educational and social expenses are now measurable trade-offs against military contract bonuses. Yet by late 2025, the Orenburg region's deficit had reached roughly 22% of revenues. The region had already redirected funds freed up by federal debt write-offs, money originally earmarked for local economic support. It had cut its enlistment bonuses fivefold last October, only to raise the bonuses again for contracts signed in 2026. This pattern suggests improvisation under pressure rather than long-term planning. What makes the story more striking is that Nizhny Novgorod, the region that Orenburg borrowed from, itself ranked among the regions with the largest budget deficits. The idea that a heavily indebted region would subsidize another invites speculation that the initiative did not originate at the regional level. Instead, it may reflect a federal preference to manage fiscal stress indirectly, redistributing burdens laterally rather than expanding federal transfers. Until now, regional payments to contract soldiers were financed internally, through budget reshuffling, reserve funds, or other debt relief mechanisms. The appearance of horizontal subsidies in this context signals that the financial architecture supporting the war effort is becoming more complex.
And now we're zooming in on Moscow and Russia's various regions to find out more in greater detail. Let's face it, many of Russia's regions are broke, not tight on cash or experiencing temporary budget constraints. Broke in the way that makes governors start borrowing money from their neighbors and hiring extra bodyguards. For years, the Kremlin has sold the idea that Russia is a strong, centralized state. The problem is that centralized in Moscow means something very specific. The center takes the money, and the periphery takes the blame. Russia's oblasts, krais, and republics collect a large share of taxes locally, but Moscow siphons off most of that revenue and then sends back whatever it feels like sending back. Governors are still expected to carry out federal mandates, social programs, infrastructure promises, and now, most expensively, recruitment bonuses for the war against Ukraine. But the Kremlin just hands them down like commandments and then walks away from the bill. So what happens in real terms? Regional budgets collapse, schools get fewer resources, and local infrastructure projects are frozen. Hospitals are told to optimize, which really means figure out how to do the same job with half the money and twice the paperwork. Meanwhile, the federal center continues to spend lavishly on its own priorities: security services, propaganda, prestige projects, and, of course, the war. The political genius of this arrangement is that when people get angry about potholes, unpaid wages, or collapsing clinics, they shout at the governor, not at the men in Moscow who designed the system. They have engineered a fiscal model in which governors are political shock absorbers. Think about it as authoritarian outsourcing, and so far it has worked. The Kremlin keeps its image of untouchable authority, while governors become lightning rods for every budget cut and every unpaid promise. Now, this is where the story becomes more dangerous for the Kremlin. Right now, governors remain loyal because their careers depend on presidential favor. They can be hired and fired at will. But loyalty under coercion is nothing more than compliance. And compliance evaporates quickly when the center weakens. If Russia enters a succession crisis after Vladimir Putin, the balance of fear and reward that holds the system together is likely to wobble. Governors who today dutifully execute orders may tomorrow present themselves as defenders of their regions against an extractive center. Not because they suddenly discovered federalism, you see, but because survival is a powerful ideology. The Kremlin's fiscal design is creating exactly the kind of political risk it claims to prevent. By starving the regions of money while flooding them with obligations, Moscow is teaching governors that the center is a liability, not a partner, and by allowing regions to start bailing each other out, it is opening the door, just a crack, to networks of cooperation that do not run through Moscow. And joining us here today to shed more light on this story is Paul Goebel, Distinguished Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to TDP World.
Thank you for having me.
So last time we spoke, I remember that we had a fairly philosophical discussion about ethno-nationalism and the changing identity of Russia. But is it the case that, in fact, a much more significant, a much more urgent source of tension is way more mundane than that, and namely that this is all about taxes, really?
Well, the power to tax is the power to destroy. And so if you have the power to arrange taxes in a certain way, you can determine which groups will prosper and which groups will fail. And Moscow's tax policies with respect to the regions and republics are such that it is guaranteeing those that will succeed and the far larger number who will fail.
So they're being squeezed out, essentially, and Moscow is taking the most of that, right? I mean, it all goes into the capital, and the regions are basically given what is left.
The regions are allowed to keep roughly 30% of the taxes they collect, and then have to transfer 70% of the taxes to Moscow. Moscow then returns some of this, but Moscow's requirements of what the regions have to do in terms of housing, schools, paying for recruits to Putin's army are all unfunded liabilities. And unless the center returns something to the regions, they're in big trouble, as is now the case.
So this is a paradoxical situation for them, right? Because, as you're saying, first they have certain demands that they have to meet, but also they have to give away most of the money collected in taxes to the capital. So in short, they're pretty much being asked to do the impossible. How are they coping with that?
Well, what's happening first is that a lot of things aren't being done. In about 80% of the regions since the start of the war, the regional governments have stopped repairing housing. That's led to the disasters of electricity being shut off, water not running, heating not working across the country. Another way they've tried to do it is to borrow heavily from the center. The center's happy enough to do that in some cases because it makes the regions even more indebted and even more under Moscow's thumb. A third way is that some of the regions are taking the creative way of borrowing money or arranging to get money from neighboring regions. This has happened between the Orenburg and which is a traditionally hard-pressed region, and Novosibirsk, so that what you have is a situation where regions are trying to help one another. But I think the most important thing that's happening here is that regional leaders, all of whom now were appointed by Vladimir Putin and are considered to be Putin loyalists, are being put under such pressure by him that it's entirely possible that some or all of them will decide enough is enough, and they will then become not Putin's props, as it were, but become a threat to the Kremlin leader. That happened at the end of the 1980s, and I think in some ways it's happening again, even though these people now were not elected as were those in 1990 and 91.
But how much scope do they really have if they wanted to stage, perhaps not a rebellion, but if they wanted to go their own way, if they wanted to make their voices heard, if they said, okay, like you're saying, enough is enough. We also have certain requirements. We're no longer going to exactly implement every single policy that the Kremlin dictates. Wouldn't this just end with a massive purge and, these governors being replaced by another wave of loyalists who will jump at the opportunity, because this for them would be essentially like, a generational chance. Like they might have been nobodies, like ordinary officials, and now they are being offered the chance. You can be the governor, but the only thing you have to do is you need to listen to orders coming from Moscow, full stop.
Well, obviously, a purge is what the Kremlin would try, and it may very well be the most likely outcome. But the fact is that when ever more leaders in the regions and republics can see that that's how Moscow is going to respond, one way, of course, is to simply say, well, we have no choice but to agree. Another is we can do things that will harm what Moscow wants, and then if Moscow tries to do anything against one or more of us, it may be necessary for us to resist more broadly. For example, if you don't have enough money to fix housing and also repair rail lines or bridges that go through your territory, you can disrupt a lot of the things Moscow wants to do quite easily. While that might, if it were visited only a few places, lead to more obedience and a purge of the people who tried it, if it became widespread, Moscow would find it difficult to go after everybody all at once. If it tried that, it might, in the end, create a crisis that would backfire.
But if they really wanted to do that, wouldn't they need popular support? Unless this would be something really unspectacular, like, a series of discussion taking place within the corridors of power. If this was supposed to be something more widespread, wouldn't they need to rely on ordinary people in the regions as well? And would those people be willing to follow them into this rather unequal struggle against the Kremlin?
Well, the role of the population in most occasions in Russian history is small. That isn't to say they couldn't play a role in the event of a more serious crisis. But initially, as you say, this would be a fight within the corridors of power. But if the regions win some victories, and they may, indeed some places it appears they already have, then they'll learn this lesson that it's worth fighting this so that they do have more choices and they have more resources. Republics and regions that are in a position to block what the Kremlin wants, even a little bit, often are given resources because that's a cheaper option for the Kremlin than simply an outright ban or purge. And that takes place over time. Eventually, they may gain more popular support precisely because they're doing that. But popular support in a authoritarian or even totalitarian system like that of Vladimir Putin isn't nearly as important as bureaucratic support. And if the bureaucratic support erodes, then I think you'll see the population entering and playing a role. Again, I don't think the absence of popular support necessarily affects this particular battle at this particular time. I think that's a question for the future.
But let's also put things in perspective, right? Someone listening to this might be thinking, okay, so if these regions are on the brink of bankruptcy, because some of them clearly have financial issues, does it mean that we might be seeing a major collapse of the Russian Federation just around the corner? Because I'm assuming this is not the case. This perhaps would have been the desired scenarios for many commentators. But how far away are we from a major widespread crisis that would go beyond simply, trying to negotiate better sources of financing, a more just division of cash flows, more money coming back into those regions, so as to prevent any sort of significant display of disloyalty against Putin from ever taking place?
But what I'm trying to suggest is not that tomorrow we're going to see the Russian Federation in 10 pieces. What I'm trying to say is that we're seeing a change in the nature of the Putin regime. If 10 years ago, or even 5, before he launched his expanded invasion of Ukraine, Putin had faced this kind of challenge, he could certainly have moved against it because he would have had the resources to do so. Now he's stretched very thin, and that gives the regions and regional leaders an option, or a resource, if you will, that's far greater than it was. I think what we're seeing is a recalibrating of the nature of the relations between the center and the periphery. And I think to the extent that that's happening, that sets the stage for the kind of politics that are going to emerge when Vladimir Putin leaves the scene. I suspect that for the time being, he can hold things together, but I think we should not underestimate the extent to which the Russian political system is changing. The regions are becoming more active. The very fact that 2 regions would cooperate, with one helping to fund another in order to keep things going, says to me that the regional leaders are now thinking in terms very different than they thought about a decade ago. And that means that Vladimir Putin's system has changed, and in ways that don't work to his advantage. He may try to recover by using more repression or by throwing money at the problem, his 2 preferred options. But I'm not sure that will work in every case. And I'm arguing here that we need to pay attention to those changes, because they set the stage for what may happen when Vladimir Putin actually leaves the scene. We didn't pay enough attention to what was going on in the regions and republics of the USSR in 1989 and 90, and then we were surprised by what happened in 1991. What I'm trying to say is that what's happening now is more like 1989 than it is 1990, let alone 1991. If the test of whether anything matters is whether it's going to lead to a dismemberment of the USSR or the Russian Federation tomorrow, then that's a very high test, and no one's going to meet it, at least not yet. If one says, is this changing the political calculus of both the center and the periphery of the Russian Federation, and is that going to set the stage for the kind of developments that could bring it completely apart, then I think we're very much beyond that level.
Paul Goebel was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your expertise.
Thank you.
And now we're moving on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia's lower house of parliament, the State Duma, on Tuesday passed a bill requiring internet and mobile providers to comply with any binding orders from the Federal Security Service, known as the FSB, to shut down telecommunications services. Now, the legislation grants the FSB authority to issue mandatory requirements to suspend internet access and communications.
The bill was approved by 393 lawmakers in its third and final reading. The bill was initially introduced late last year by members of the Duma, arguing it would help protect citizens and state institutions amid growing security risks, including widespread disruptions linked to Ukrainian drone attacks. During revisions, references to security threats alone as formal grounds for shutdowns were removed. The amendments to Russia's law on communications now require approval from the Upper House Federation Council and Vladimir Putin's signature to enter into force. Despite this, independent reports say that the FSB's authority to order shutdowns stems from a classified decree signed by Putin last August.
Former operatives linked to the late leader of the Wagner Group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, are helping Moscow recruit sabotage agents in Europe, the Financial Times reported, citing Western intelligence officials. The effort marks a shift in Russian tactics after the wave of expulsions of Russian intelligence officers disguised as diplomats across Europe.
Officials say former Wagner recruiters are targeting financially vulnerable people across Europe, including criminals, migrants, and the unemployed. Recruits are allegedly paid small sums to carry out surveillance, arson, vandalism, and assaults. One prominent case occurred in 2023 in the United Kingdom, where authorities say a 21-year-old man was recruited through Wagner-linked Telegram channels and later helped set fire to a London warehouse connected to a Ukrainian company. Investigators described the attack as part of a broader sabotage campaign.
Nigeria has warned its citizens against recruitment to fight in armed conflicts abroad. The warning follows reports that Nigerians were being duped into joining the Russian army to fight in Ukraine.
In a statement Sunday, Nigeria's foreign ministry said it was concerned about rising and alarming cases of citizens being illegally recruited abroad. The ministry, however, did not name Russia directly. An independent investigation concluded that at least 36 Nigerians have joined the Russian army so far, with 5 reportedly killed in combat. Officials say some victims were misled or coerced into signing military contracts before being sent to the front. Similar accounts have surfaced in Kenya. An investigation from AFP found that several Kenyans were promised well-paid jobs in Russia. Instead, many reported that they were forced to sign contracts written in Cyrillic and deployed to Ukraine.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news, updates and commentary.